Excellent. Let's wind the clock forward now to credible leaders and your organization now, and been studying a little bit about what you do. And I've seen that you've got a interesting approach to measuring leadership. Tell us more about why you think it's important to measure leadership and how you go about it.
Yeah. That's as I started Credible Leaders, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to help individuals as well as teams and companies measure leadership, but then also improve leadership. So I always say we do two things. We measure leadership and we improve leadership. And one of the reasons that I believe it's so important to measure leadership is because, first of all, in order to measure something, you have to have it clearly identified what it is. And we talked about earlier, ask 10 people what leadership is and you'll get 10 different answers. Google it and it's just all over the map. And I want to help organizations crisply and cleanly define leadership so that they can then measure it, right? And so I don't care if a team or a person settles on my definition of leadership. I just want to help them come away with a definition that is really, really clear to them on what leadership is. And then I want to help them measure leadership. And so what we've discovered, if you will, as we started investigating that and asking people, well, how do you measure leadership? We discovered that I believe a lot of people are measuring leadership the wrong way. The majority of the responses that we will get to the question, how do you measure leadership? The majority of those answers are related to attrition. So they'll talk about, if we have a high percentage of attrition in our team, then we know our leadership is struggling. Well, my challenge to that is, if that's your metric, it's too late. It's almost like looking at the scoreboard at the end of a sporting event, at the end of a game. Well, the game's over. You can't change the score now. And so if you're looking at attrition, for instance, and you have a high level of attrition, well, you've already lost the best performers probably in your team. And so at that point, it's kind of too late to measure leadership. And so what we're trying to do is equip individuals to measure leadership real time, right now. How effective is my leadership? Because I don't want individuals or teams using those metrics like attrition. And I see others use like a percentage of goals met. Well, again, if you didn't meet the goal, it's too late. If at the end of the year you didn't meet your revenue goal, it's too late. I want to measure that now so that I can see if I'm going to meet that goal at the end of the year. And so that's what we're trying to do with leadership, enable people to measure it right now, and then take the action necessary to actually see that measurement or that score, see it improve.
Yeah, interesting. And if I play off that a little bit, people do improve what they measure, right? So if they know that they're going to be measured on something, that's what they will focus on for sure.
Right.
And with the other examples that you spoke about with different type of goal attainments, et cetera, they may find out other ways of achieving that goal that are maybe not the ways that you want them to. So
that's correct.
And then I think anything that increases someone's awareness of where their strengths are so that they can build on those strengths, and awareness of where their shortcomings are so that they can either work with those shortcomings, improve those shortcomings, or deal with them in other ways, having people around them that help them cover their blind spots, et cetera, et cetera. So anything that heightens awareness is certainly worthwhile. In the measuring leadership approach that you've got, you came up with a formula around that. So can you share that with the audience?
Yeah. You touched on something just there that really highlights my feeling around the need for a formula, or what we call the leadership equation. And that is that when we're measuring leadership, I want to, as much as possible, make it an objective measurement, right? Because people are more willing to accept an objective measurement and then do the action necessary to improve that measurement. If if that measurement is in some way it's related to emotions or feelings, if it's subjective in some way, then people tend to hold up their defenses to it, not accept it as readily, and certainly aren't as willing to do the hard work necessary to make it better, to improve it. But when a measurement is objective, and in my opinion, nothing gets more objective than math, right? I used to say when I was in school that math was my favorite subject because in most cases, there's only one correct answer, right? When you were in your English class or your literature class and you were writing your opinion on a poem or something like that, well, your opinion on the poem may differ from the professor's opinion on of the poem. And so there's that subjectivity. But in math, there's one answer, there's one right answer. And so that was the reason that I really felt compelled to, let's build a formula, a leadership equation, as we call it, that will give individuals a score, right? A number. And then we can work on the components of that equation or the variables of that equation, and we can see that number rise. And, again, it's an objective score, it's a number. But then because I can see that number rise, well, now I get the energy, I get the motivation behind that around, well, I want to increase my number even higher and higher and higher. And so that was the reason that we developed this leadership equation. And me just being a math nerd, I felt the need for a leadership equation, but it has 4 variables in it. And those 4 variables are, and we'll dive into any of these or all of these if you like, but those 4 variables are credibility, competence, your motive, reasons for being a leader, and then lastly, leadership. And then I've put those together in a mathematical equation that gives those 4 components a different weight, if you will, because each of those 4 components have a differing impact to your leadership effectiveness.
All right. Thanks, Michael. We will delve into that one. Just a quick correction. You said at the end, you said leadership in your formula, it's relationship. I think it was just
yes. It is a relationship. Yes.
No,
not leadership.
it
Sorry.
was just a slip. It's okay. We know that you know what your quotient is. The interesting thing here that I want to delve into is about self-awareness. Mm-hmm. How are you using the tool? I played with it myself earlier today, and I did find it kind of interesting. And I do believe that I am quite self-aware, but that's me answering the questions.
Yeah.
Do you also use it in any kind of 360 approach where the person's boss and their team might also respond on the leader's behalf?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, Nick. And yeah, so with that leadership equation, we've built what we call the leadership calculator, and it's basically a questionnaire. And then it applies your responses to to those questions into the equation, and it spits out for you a number. And you are exactly correct. And I say it this way, it sounds harsh, but I say it this way. My perception of my leadership doesn't matter at all. What matters is the team that I lead, those individuals, their perception of my leadership. That's what really matters. And so we do allow individuals to use the leadership calculator on their own behalf, just so that you can see it, you can experience it, and so forth. But just recognize we tend to have an overinflated perception of ourselves. And so the real power in the leadership calculator is to send it to your team members, your peers, your boss, your leaders, and so forth. Send it to other people. And after someone takes the leadership calculator and gets their own score, that's when they're given the opportunity to send it to other people. And those others, they can be your team members, they can be your boss, they can be your peers, whatever. They will take that very, very similar assessment. They will take it anonymously. That way, you're getting candid feedback from them, but then you get back a very similar report, but it's much more valuable to you because now it's the perception of those that you're leading, not your own.
Yeah. 1,000%. Leadership is all about other people, right? And it's not about
Right.
whether your result resonates with you. It's whether your leadership resonates with others. What'd
That's
be
right.
really interesting from what I just said, Michael, is then to compare. And let's say across the different categories that you've got in your calculator, let's say that I score myself as, oh yeah, I always do this. And the
Mhm.
team go, really, Mick? Do you?
Right.
And
Right.
they score somewhere else. Blind spot. And it might help you to identify where you think that you're knocking it out of the park and the rest of the team are not so sure. That could be really not just to
Yes.
get the team to report, but to compare their report on you to your report on you to test that self-perception.
Yeah, in some of my leadership training, building out that scoreboard is exactly uh, what we do with our clients, right? So we have a scoreboard where you will place on that scoreboard your perception of your leadership, and then you will plot on that scoreboard everyone else's perception of you, right? So as those individual results come in,
Mm.
you won't know who they are, again, because they're anonymous, but you're going to plot on that scoreboard where those team members scored you. And one, it's eye opening to see, hey, here I was up here, but everybody else kind of sees me down here. But then that collectively really gives you a clear roadmap as to what areas of the leadership equation do you really need to be focused on. Um, that view of the scoreboard that we develop with individuals, it can, for instance, pinpoint, hey, you really need to be working on your relationships. People believe in your competence and your history, your credibility, but they don't feel like they can relate to you. They don't know you well enough to be able to relate to you. So you really need to be working on your relationship, and building out that scoreboard with the results from all those other individuals really helps an individual pinpoint
Mm.
where the biggest bang for their buck is, if you will, related to what you should focus on in the leadership equation.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that would be really powerful, Michael. The other thing that we're talking about here, you made a very interesting comment before about then moving the needle and improving. And one
Mhm.
of the things I want to say to the people at home is, unlike IQ, things like leadership and your EQ is something that you can work on and you can improve it over time if you know where you need to work on it. What's your
Yeah,
reflection on that?
no, I totally agree with that. I'm of the opinion that leadership is learned. We're not born leaders. Now, I recognize that some people have natural characteristics that may make leadership easier. So, for instance, I believe that leadership is probably easier for an extrovert than it is an introvert. But I definitely believe that leadership is something that is learned, that it can be improved. You have to take the necessary action and do the necessary work to improve your leadership effectiveness. But it is definitely something that you can learn and that you can improve. And I believe anyone can be a great leader.
Great. Okay, let's go into the 4 parameters that you have in your
Sure.
quotient or your equation here. So let's start with credibility.
Okay.
Why does credibility rate so highly in your calculator?
Well, I don't want to nerd out on the math too much, but and I know everybody can't see the equation on the podcast here, but let me kind of first just describe the math that's in the equation, and then we'll pick apart each component. But first of all, we have credibility and competence, and those two are added together. Credibility is your track record or your history of some type of success, right? This is, at what level does your team believe that you can lead them to success? And that is added to competence. And competence is, it's that knowledge, that skill set that is necessary to get the team to success. And those two are added together. Okay. Now, that sum is then divided by your motive or your reason for being a leader. Why do you want to be a leader? And it is a divisor, because if your team questions your motives, if they believe that your motives are selfish in nature, then that's going to dramatically decrease your leadership effectiveness, right? So if they think that you're making a decision because you want to promote yourself, right? So if you're that ego-driven leader and you come in there, here's the problem and here's how we're going to fix it, they're questioning your motives at a high level there. And that's going to greatly reduce your leadership effectiveness. But then finally, that whole sum, that, credibility added to competence, that divided by motive, that whole thing is now multiplied by relationship. And it's multiplied by relationship because a high level of relationship with an individual can overcome shortcomings in a lot of those other variables, right? So for instance, if I ask a person on my team to do something and I know that it's a task no one likes to do or something like that, and I ask this person to do that task, they may initially question my motive. Well, why is he asking me to do that? But then their mind is going to quickly, but I have a really, really good relationship with Mick, and I know he's got my best interests at heart, right? And so you can see how relationship just overcame that questioning of the motive. And it'll do the same for credibility or competence or whatever, right? If you're leading into something new, you don't necessarily have a track record. You don't have a credibility associated with leading your team into that thing. But again, because you have a good relationship with those individuals, they'll say to themselves, well, I know he's got the best interest of the team at heart, and I know he's going to work hard with us, and it'll overcome that lack of credibility. So that's the whole equation. Now we can dive into each and every one of those components if you'd like.
Yeah, I'd like to just maybe pick on a few of them. So listening to what you said about relationship there, I think that comes down know, like, and trust. If they know, like, and trust you, that can overcome some of the others, particularly as you go into new territory, as you mentioned. The other one I want to throw to you and see what you think is, and we already used this word earlier in the podcast, I want to bring it up again now, and that's the word perception. I want to pick on motive here for a second and just hear your thoughts on this. It's not actually whether you have an ulterior motive or not. It's the perception of whether you have an ulterior motive. So you could have the purest motive in the world, but if your team perceive that you have some other motive, it is really going to damage your ability to influence and inspire them. Your reflections on that?
Yeah, when I talk about motive, and especially as we talk about perception of your motive, it's really your actions that drive the perception of your team. Because here's the reality: your team can't read your mind, and so they don't know what your true motives for wanting to be a leader are. Now I acknowledge some people, they are in leadership for selfish reasons. They want the prestige, they want the title, they want the compensation, whatever it might be, right? I would argue that if you're going to lead that way, your leadership is not going to be all that effective. But then there are other leaders that are in leadership for truly pure motives. They want to see people win. They want to positively impact people's lives. They want to deliver good business results and so forth, right? So they're in it for really pure reasons. That's their mental approach to leadership, but their actions don't show that to the team. So for instance, that ego-driven leader that just comes in and says, hey, here's the problem, here's the solution, let's go do it. Earlier, we talked about the leader that takes credit for the success of the team and so forth. Those are actions that shows your team that you have a selfish motive. Even if you don't have a selfish motive, when you take credit for the team's success, you've just taken the action. You've just demonstrated to them that you have a selfish motive. And the next decision you make after that, they will question your motive. Oh, well, is he making that decision again so that he can stand up in front of the board and take credit for all that we do? Right. So it's your actions that give them that perception, not your thought process.
Thanks, Michael, for sharing that. And now I get a good understanding of your equation that you've come up with. You've then extrapolated that into 5 levels of leadership. Can you describe those for our audience, please?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I felt necessary, and again, I'm a math nerd, and so I understand the math behind the leadership equation. But one of the things that I was worried about is that people would get a number from that, and they would want to compare that to an academic scale, 0 to 100, and the math is just not going to give you a good clean number like that. And so I felt the need to interpret that number, and it relates a little bit to the scoreboard that I was talking about earlier, but it's going to put each individual on one of 5 levels of leadership, if you will. And you can just kind of view a set of stairs, that's moving upwards. And I've defined those 5 levels, and then the score that you get from the equation is going to put you in one of those scores. And again, once you plot the results from everyone, then you'll be able to see really clearly which level are you on. But I've defined 5 levels that then get mapped in this scoreboard for you. And the first level is manager. And this is where really you're leading with title, right? You don't have the history behind you of success. Maybe this is that person maybe that has just been promoted, if you will, from team member to now team leader. And really the influence that you have over your team on the manager level is your title, is your position. But you move up from there, and you move up into what we call the achiever level. So now you're starting to build up that history. You're starting to build up that credibility. You have a few successes under your belt as a leader, and people are starting to see and believe that you can lead them to further success. So you're starting to achieve that success. And then in our third level, you get into what we call the transformer level. And what that is now you're starting to transform some of the members of your team. For the first time, maybe some of your team members are starting to consider leadership for themselves. And that's because your influence over them, right? You being their leader has started to transform them into thinking, well, I want to be a leader also, right? And then finally, and fourthly, you get into the influencer level. And this is where this is almost that utopia that everyone, every leader desires, where your team members would say of you, I would follow him anywhere, right? So again, this ties back to my definition of leadership greatly, in that this is where you get to that point where people are willingly following you, right? This is where, and you've probably seen this in your corporate world before, where you have a leader leading a team, and maybe they leave and go to another company. The leader leaves and goes to another company, or maybe they go to another department or another division within the company. And before you know it, 3 or 4 or more of those team members that used to report to that person, they go over to that team as well. And it's because they have such that influence over them that I would follow that person anywhere. And then lastly, at the very top, the fifth level that we have is the multiplier. And basically what that is as the leader, you're multiplying yourself. You're creating other very influential leaders. People are now leaving your team, but they're leaving your team to be another influential leader of another team, just like you are. And so those are the 5 levels, and the equation is going to put you on one of those 5 levels, and then give you insight into, well, what do I need to do to go to the next level?
Something that you said there really rings true with something I saw on your website, and something that is very relevant to the leadership project. And that was leaders developing other leaders. And I can see that at that level 5 level that you're talking about. The other thing, when I'm hearing you talk through that journey, I can then relate it back to your equation, and I can see how at the base level, putting the foundations in place is that credibility and competence. You will never get to the higher levels of being a transformer, an influencer. You'll never get to these levels without clear motives and relationships and the way that you relate to other people. So yeah, I can 100% see where you got with your journey.
Yeah. And that's why that mapping out that scoreboard that I talked about is so powerful. And again, because I'm the math nerd behind all of this, then I can tell that, if you're on the manager level, then you need to be focused on building that credibility and that competence. But if you're somewhere in the high achiever level, or maybe the transformer level relationship. And that's what you got to be focused on. And so that's the beauty of that, is that we can look at your level that you're on, and we can know what elements of the leadership equation do you need to be working on.
So let's go on to that in terms of improving leadership then. That's a good segue. So let's say that someone has come to you, Michael, come to your website or come to your organization. They've been through the leadership calculator. They've come out the other end, understanding a little bit more about themselves, and hopefully they got their team involved, not just doing it themselves, as we mentioned. They're understanding where they sit on the level 1 to level 5 levels of leadership. What's next? What do they do next to then put something into action?
Yeah, so it really depends on kind of where they land in the 5 levels and what their score is as to which of the 4 components that they really need to focus on first. I'm a firm believer that you can't focus on all 4. Now, I do believe that you as a leader need to be doing some element that's going to, doing some activities that are going to constantly be improving all 4 areas. But I think you've got to be intentional and focused on one at a time, right? And so, for instance, if I'm working with someone and we recognize that motive is probably the one element of the equation that I believe is most misunderstood and most questioned as to how do I improve that? Because again, sometimes I have leaders that are transparent enough to say, well, I'm in leadership just because I wanted the title. I wanted to be a vice president of so-and-so. And okay, I get that. I'm okay with that. But how do we change those motives? But then also, how do we take the action necessary to demonstrate to your team that you have selfless motives, right? That you really have the best interests of the team at heart. And so we'll work with those clients and talk about the actions that they need to be taking. And oftentimes it's related to appreciation, right? When we're talking about motives, I will usually start with, how often do you express appreciation to your team members for doing a good job? And oftentimes they'll think through that and say, well, you know what? I don't really do that all that often. Well, those are actions that will prove to your team members, give them that perception that your motives are selfless and not selfish. If you're willing to take the time to recognize that they're doing something right or correct or above and beyond, and then you take the time to properly express appreciation to them, be specific about what they did and so forth, and express your appreciation to them, those are actions that will improve your motive score of the equation, right? And so it really kind of depends on which of those 4 elements of the equation do we need to focus on. But again, I kind of believe you should be moving the needle on all 4, but we can really pinpoint for you which is the one that's really going to make the biggest difference for you if you start applying the right actions to it.
And if they are going to make some transformative change in those areas, what do you recommend? Is it education? Is it coaching, mentoring? What's the best way for someone to move?
Yeah, so we help our clients through a number of different ways to do this. We have courses, we have online courses where they can accelerate their leadership growth, because what we do is we dive into each of those components and give them very specific step-by-step kind of instructions on, here's how you can improve your competence score, or here's how you can improve your leadership score, or I'm sorry, relationship score. We talk about what all that means and how to do that. But we also do it on an individual coaching basis, as well as we do it in group workshops and corporate leadership strategies. So we partner with companies to become essentially their leadership development firm. And so we work with those leadership individuals within that company on a long-term basis, multiple years at times, because this is something, it takes time, right? You don't take one action. I should have said this earlier. One expression of appreciation is not going to move the needle all that much for you in terms of motive. But if you do that with multiple team members, and you begin to do that on a consistent basis, then now you've really started moving the needle in motive. And so that's the reason that I believe, long-term, you have to have a long-term strategy for leadership development. And we partner with companies as well as individuals to do that.
Very good. And coming back to our point before,
Mm-hmm.
leadership can be improved. So this is
Absolutely.
something that you can address, and to do so, it does require some kind of level of awareness of where you need to do the work. And then it requires action. It requires
Mm-hmm.
deliberate action. It doesn't just happen magically. It requires consistent action and purpose and meaning. So
Yes,
that's excellent, Michael. Look, thank you so much. That probably draws us to a close in our interview today. I would like to finish up with our rapid fire round that we do with our guests. So I've got four questions for you.
All right.
What is your favorite book?
Boy, that's a really difficult question, Mick, because I'm a prolific reader, and there's lots of really great books that I love out there. I think, so I will restrict it to leadership books, right?
Okay.
And I think probably right now, one of the most powerful leadership books that I've read recently is a book entitled Extreme Ownership.
Mm.
And it's written by two Navy SEALs. Really, it comes down to what I was saying earlier. You always, as a leader, accept the blame. It doesn't matter at what level of your organization some fault was made. As the leader, you always accept the blame. So this idea of extreme ownership. And the book talks about the beauty in that is when you accept the ownership of whatever is at fault, now you have the power to control it or to change it. If you constantly say, well, that was just his fault. Well, now you've given up all ability to change that, to fix it, to make it better. But if you take, as a leader, if you take the ownership of that, now you have the power to fix it and make it better. So the Extreme Ownership, that's probably my favorite book right now.
One of the things that I see a lot of there is the tendency to blame your predecessor instead of taking ownership of the cards that you dealt and making the most of the hand that you have. All right. So
right. When you're blaming the guy that's already gone, now you have no ability now to change that.
Yeah, good. Okay. What's your favorite quote?
Oh, again, gosh, so many good ones. But again, I'll keep it to leadership. And honestly, I don't even know who to attribute this to. I've researched this quote before, and there's not a good, clean attribution of this, who said this first. And in fact, some actually attribute it to some verses in the Bible. But my favorite leadership quote is this: if serving is beneath you, then leadership is beyond you. Right. So if somehow you can't be a servant, well, then you can't be a leader.
That's really nice. I'm going to remember that one. I'm going to put that up on the show notes for this one. That's a really nice quote. Thank you, Michael.
Sure. Next
question. What's the one thing that you know now that you wish you knew when you were 20?
Oh my goodness. It's hard for me to even remember 20 at this stage. But I said it earlier. My earliest leadership lessons were in the Marine Corps. And when I was there, I thought it was all about rank and authority and position and title. And it wasn't until after the fact that I could look back and recognize good leadership in the Marine Corps and recognize the leadership lessons that I was learning. You mentioned Simon Sinek earlier. You probably know that he has a book entitled Leaders Eat Last. Mm-hmm. And he wrote that book after being with a group of Marines. And that is a principle that I learned in the Marine Corps, that the officers, the leaders, they eat last. And they do so because that's an act of service, right? They want their team members to eat first. And so I just wish, as a 20-year-old, I wish I had been able to connect those dots and recognize the power of servant leadership and not attempted to lead out of rank or authority or title.
Very good. And finally, Michael, I'm sure people in the audience are going to be intrigued by what we've been talking about today, particularly around the leadership equation and the leadership calculator, etc. if people want to get in contact with you or with Credible Leaders, how do they find you?
Yeah, the best place to go is credibleleaders.com. Go to our website. It's really, really clear on what next steps to take. You can easily utilize the leadership calculator that we talked about earlier, but I would start there, credibleleaders.com. And as far as social media, my most prolific platform is LinkedIn. So look for me there on LinkedIn. You'll find me, and I'd love to connect with you there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. I certainly got a lot out of today's episode, and I'm sure that our audience will as well. So thank you so much for your time. We wish you the best of luck with your business and with helping leaders to find themselves and their own leadership capabilities, and to help leaders develop other leaders. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Mick. It's a real honor to have the opportunity to serve your audience. Thank you so much.